Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Chatham House 2020 Trade Conference, this year entitled Global Trade 2020, Towards Meaningful and Sustainable Reform. We're thrilled that you're able to join us. We are obviously sorry you cannot be with us in person again this year, as we've been so fortunate to have you in the past. But as you all have seen from the agenda, we've got a very exciting program over the next couple of days, which I think will cover all of the important issues on the global trade agenda at the moment. And with the selection of a new WTO Director General in the very near offing, it adds an additional dimension of importance to this moment. But as you know, we'll be tackling later on the day issues of the new patterns in global trade, the power dynamics, the big players, the future of technology, the future of climate and its impacts on global trade, and obviously the reform to the trade governance system. And I do just want to say that from a Chatham House perspective, we're especially pleased to be running the conference this year because we've launched our own Global Trade Policy Forum. A lot of the work that we're drawing together into these panels and the setup of them draws on the work of my colleagues, Maria Pestinger and others, in running this particular project. So having you with us today to help feed ideas and input to our own work makes it especially good. Before I introduce our keynote opening speaker, let me just say a couple of process items for you all to be aware of. This meeting is taking place on the record, and the opening remarks by our keynote speaker, Liz Truss, who I again will introduce properly in a minute, are also being live streamed. And the recorded event will be available on the Conference Plus platform. Those of you who are joining us on our Conference Plus platform will be available on demand after the conference if you want to go back to it. You can submit your questions throughout the event. Please use the chat function on the Conference Plus platform where you are right now if you want to do that, please. And of course, very importantly, I must thank our two conference sponsors, without whom we would not really be able to do this full subject. It's justice. So EY, AIG are our two supporters for this conference, and our heartfelt thanks to them for their support for all of our work on this conference and on the global trade agenda. So having made those opening remarks, it is my great pleasure to welcome the Secretary of State for International Trade, President of the Board of Trade, Liz Truss. Liz, I hope you don't mind me first naming you from now on.
Not at all.
That's probably the right way to do it. Appointed, as I think everyone knows here, in the summer of 2019 to this role, and also almost simultaneously to the role as Minister for Women and Equalities. She's somebody who in her relatively brief parliamentary career of some 10 years has held a lot of the important positions in government, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs from July 2014 to July 2016, also Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice and Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the position she held really leading up to this one that she holds currently. Secretary of State, great to have you with us. I know you're going to address a topic that is of great interest to all of our members here and all of the people joining this conference on the future of UK trade policy. And obviously what a time for the UK to be unmooring itself with its trade policy into the global trade agenda that we're going to be discussing later on today. So as one of the big economies of the world that is letting itself go from the EU commercial trade policy, it will be a particularly time to do it, and we're interested to hear your views. So over to you, Liz Truss. We look forward to your remarks, and we will be taking a few questions at the end. Make sure you'll put your questions into the system as soon as you can. Thank you. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Robin, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about our value-generating and values-driven trade policy that will see the United Kingdom help lead the fight for free trade. In a COVID-battered world riven by trade wars and trade barriers, global Britain's return is timely. After nearly 50 years without our own voice, we're back at the table. And we can use our G7 presidency next year to lead the global fight back for free and fair trade, challenging those who won't play by the rules. Yet all ventures start at home. more often in these times, in fact. And we need the British people to join us in our value-generating and values-driven trade policy. Some will share my excitement about the opportunities ahead, while others will be nervous. But we all know that trade and the investment it brings delivers jobs, better living standards, and higher wages at home. In turn, the best of British business excels by going global. That's why we see Yorkshire tea sold in over 30 countries. Rodders from Cornwall is now the world's largest producer of clotted cream, and the Blythe-based Tharsis selling its Ocado robotics around the world. If so many of us can see that free trade is a force for good, why do some people treat it like the source of all evil? That question has been wrestled with through the ages. As the Whig historian Thomas Macaulay once lamented, free trade, one of the greatest blessings which a government can confer on a people, is in almost every country unpopular. This government's been evangelical about the value of free trade. My friend the Prime Minister led from the top in February when he reminded us in his great Greenwich speech that Richard Cobden came to conclude that trade was God's diplomacy. In that spirit, I urged my newly appointed Board of Trade earlier this month to make the case around the world as the Cobden, Peel and Bright of the 21st century, and to re-establish the UK as a major voice in global trade. Yet trade is too often seen as a bogeyman, to blame for many problems, whether that be global warming, deindustrialization, and even childhood obesity. These critics forget that trade does a world of good. Free trade is a lean, green, value-creating machine. It's lifted billions out of poverty across the world. It's led to a cleaner environment, and it's put food on people's plates. It helps developing and developed nations alike. And that helps explain why, when I talk to our friends and allies, they have great interest in doing more business with Britain, and they put their money where their mouth is. We're the top destination in Europe for foreign direct investment. In technology, we attract more investment than France and Germany put together. We are third in the world for the number of so-called tech unicorns, and can see this in scores of British success stories, such as Zoopla, Deliveroo, and Monzo. Official figures just the other week found that the UK video games industry is growing at its fastest rate on record. This shows the success enjoyed by British developers, be they the ones who made Assassin's Creed in Newcastle, Donkey Kong in Leicestershire, or Grand Theft Auto in Edinburgh. And it's safe for gamers to take this as a sign that the UK will level up. For all the benefits to our fast-growing industries, the benefits they will bring us in the future, we must learn from the mistakes of the past. In opening ourselves up to embrace more fantastic opportunities, we need to maintain a sustainable approach which commands widespread support and democratic legitimacy. There were mistakes when the World Trade Organization allowed new and large economies to join in the early 2000s without being subject to the same disciplines as existing members. Turning a blind eye has let pernicious practices run rife. When nations use their muscle to artificially promote state-subsidized products, the free market is subverted. When intellectual property is not fully protected, or technology transfer is enforced, innovators have no reason to carry on innovating. Rather than challenge this, too many countries acted like the mercenaries of global trade, looking the other way while artificially low-cost goods undermined legitimate business. But a few cheap phones and TVs will never make up for a nation selling off its security or subverting its sovereignty. In the long run, it damages free enterprise and free trade. Indulging this behavior has had a corrosive effect on the foundations of our rules-based system, spreading disillusionment and distrust. And this hasn't been helped by politicians talking about trade deals in terms of shopping days without fully engaging with the concerns the public have. Take the European Union's ill-fated efforts to negotiate the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Their pursuit of what would have been Europe's largest trade deal yet ended up producing one of Europe's largest petitions, as over 3 million people made their opposition clear. This showed no matter how great a deal might be on the table, people are not going to go along with a process in which they've got no trust. And when you lose trust, it's all too easy to imagine the worst. So those consumers who joined the TTIP backlash, fearing the price the UK might pay for a deal, can rest assured. Taking back control of our trade policy means the British people are back in the driving seat. Free trade has been blamed for all sorts, but we must not unfairly scapegoat it and lurk towards protectionism. The fact is that the UK's industrial heartlands have not been failed by bad trade, but rather by bad policy. Cutting off an economy will not fix the lack of decent infrastructure, transport links, and skills support, but it will consign industry to decline. Protectionism paves the way to poverty, not to prosperity. An industry needs to be open up to ideas and opportunities from the global market. Openness is needed to develop economic resilience. Otherwise, when a shock like this crisis comes along, you're left exposed with nowhere else to buy your goods from and nowhere else to sell them to. I can tell you here today that Britain is learning from the twin errors of values-free globalization and protectionism, and we're instead rooting our approach to global free trade in our values of sovereignty, democracy, the rule of law, and a fierce commitment to high standards. In control of our trading future, we'll work with like-minded democracies to support freedom, human rights, and the environment while boosting enterprise by lowering barriers to trade. Our red lines remain at the heart of this values-driven approach, namely, our NHS remains off the table. Our food standards must not be undermined, and British farming must benefit. And any trade deal must level up our country. Now we have taken back control of our trade policy and our sovereignty. Many have been asking whether our future lies in sticking with America or Europe. The UK did not leave the European Union to have another country's values thrust upon it. We support the right kind of globalization, based on shared values, as we help lead the fight for free markets, free societies, human rights, and a greener world. Rather than pull up the drawbridge in an autarkic Britain first approach, this great island nation is building bridges across the world. We're working more closely with long-standing allies and nations who share our values. I call this approach putting friends and family first. The values driving our new independent trade policy are well known. Our friends know how strongly freedom has delivered and driven the UK's national story, whether they think back to the historic advancement of human rights under Magna Carta, the abolition of the slave trade, or the development of free market economics. Our long-standing partners know the British sense of compassion, and that as a nation of animal lovers, we hate animal cruelty, so much that this government is pushing forward legislation to bring in amongst the toughest sanctions in Europe for animal abusers. Our allies can see how much we care about the environment in the work we're doing for the COP26 Global Climate Change Conference. The British people care deeply about fairness, decency, and liberty. We can best spread our fundamental values, freedom, democracy, human rights, and protecting our natural environment for the future by working with our friends and family across the world. By embracing our long-standing partners, not literally, of course, in this COVID age, we're supporting democracy, rules-based trade, and a cleaner planet. Our coalition of the willing will not just deliver better values across the world, but help deliver economic value. And that is why I call our trade policy value generating and values driven. In an age when our services, digital and data trade is growing, modern economic models based on geography are becoming less relevant. We can challenge the tyranny of geography by selling our brilliant computer games, apps, and robotics right across the world. With more negotiations ongoing right now than any other nation, we're working day and night to create a cat's cradle of trade deals across the Atlantic and Pacific, with the UK at its heart. And that's why we're seeking what I call British-shaped deals, because they're shaped to suit the strengths of our economy, to support our values, and to show what more we can achieve as a newly independent nation. These agreements also protect us against protectionism, shielding businesses from arbitrary tariffs or arbitrary bans by foreign authorities. The high standards forward-leaning agreement I signed with Japan last week provides a concrete example of our approach. That's why it receives such widespread support from the best of British industry, from City UK and Tech UK to Scottish salmon producers and the National Farmers Union, amongst so many others. Knocking down senseless trade barriers and shaping sensible rules will help innovative businesses succeed. Our deal brings two like-minded democracies together in our shared values, as well as our consumers in shared tastes, as we enjoy more of each other's high-quality goods and cutting-edge services. There is much more I could say about this deal, but we wouldn't have any time for questions. Global Britain is already defying the doubters. We want to carry on proving them wrong, and we have no time to waste. After agreeing the Japan deal in record time, the UK is already on to its fifth round with the US, nearing its third round with Australia and a continuity deal with Canada, finishing its second round with New Zealand, and in full flow with a variety of other partners. These talks support our plans to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would realise the vision of a global Britain that looks far beyond its own shores by coupling us to one of the most dynamic trading areas in the world. Even then, we're just getting started. Whilst we're making fast progress towards the government's ambition to cover 80% of UK trade and free trade agreements by 2022, our trade policy is focused far beyond the next 2 years. In time, we have the ambition of striking an economically valuable and values-driven deal with India, also the Gulf, and our Latin American friends across the Mercosur bloc. Once we've joined TPT and agreed a free trade deal with our American friends, British businesses will be able to sell their wares directly in a more comprehensive way into the world's most vibrant markets. This would mean global Britain has unprecedented and deep access to over 40% of the world's gross domestic product, which equates to over £27 trillion. If we add in our EU friends, with whom we want a relationship centred on free trade between sovereign equals, this would equate to over £40 trillion. And there will be something for every British business. Those who work in advanced manufacturing, food and drink, services, digital and data will all be covered. As a newly independent trading nation, unparalleled opportunities lie ahead of us. Our economy can move into top gear after decades in the slow lane, stuck behind the EU's high tariff wall. Now we'll hitch ourselves to the fastest growing economies of the world and unleash our full potential. Over 32 years ago, EU leaders were rightly warned by Margaret Thatcher that Europe never will prosper as a narrow-minded, inward-looking club. But now we're on track to join a truly broad-minded, outward-looking club, the CPTPP. And together we can help shape sensible, business-friendly rules that cover services, digital and data, whilst putting pressure on the WTO to reform in kind. We're already working with our Commonwealth family to do so much better, and not just by drafting in one of their former prime ministers onto our Board of Trade. The UK is a founding member of a global partnership on artificial intelligence with Australia and New Zealand. And we're working with our Australian friends to build the next generation of cutting-edge frigates. As a newly independent nation, we can help innovation flourish more than under the innovation-phobic EU's watch. Something as simple as transferring data across borders ends up being needlessly complicated by the EU, preventing UK firms from doing digitally enabled business abroad. There's room for a moderate science-led approach to gene editing. But rather than take a pragmatic approach, as the UK is now free to do, the EU has shunned transformational ideas. Take golden rice, the superfood developed as a humanitarian project to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Despite being deemed safe by our like-minded allies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, Brussels has yet to agree. Taking back control means that the UK can become the ideas factory of the world, greater freedom to innovate and craft modern rules that will help our entrepreneurs thrive. That's how we can build on our current status as one of the best places in the world to do business, with the UK already in second place amongst the G7. There's no reason why the country once known as the workshop of the world cannot become a global hub for the services and tech trade. The people once mocked by Napoleon as a nation of shopkeepers can stand tall as a nation of traders, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Together with our friends and family, we can be at the heart of a new trading order rooted in our shared values and bring economic value to all. To succeed as a newly independent trading nation, we need the trust and support of the British people. We will work hard to earn that trust and to engage everyone across the country in our trade policy. My pitch to the people of Britain is this: the UK is setting out its own path in which we will neither sacrifice our values, freedom, democracy, human rights, and the environment, nor our economic opportunity. Our approach has already been proven to deliver, as our Japan deal shows, and there is more to come. Our friends and allies stand ready to help us, but the British people will be our most important ally of all. British farmers can join us in making the case for better animal welfare standards at the WTO. British businesses can help us cut the red tape that stops them getting their high-value products into world markets. British innovators can help us unleash our full potential. We're on their side, working with our friends and family first to support British values and spread economic prosperity. Anything that does not deliver for Britain will remain on the shelf. To coin a familiar phrase, no deal is better than a bad deal. And once we're happy with any new agreement, it goes through one of the most transparent scrutiny regimes in the world, so everyone can see it delivers for our economic interests and values. I will only sign deals like the one we did with Japan, which I am confident will be met by approval by Parliament. Those still nervous about the exciting opportunities ahead can be assured that we have taken their concerns to heart. Everyone will know how passionately I feel as a former DEFRA secretary about agriculture. Our Trade and Agriculture Commission will ensure that everyone's voices are heard as we seek new opportunities for our farmers while maintaining the UK's world-leading status in animal welfare and the environment. We've legislated to ban the import of chlorinated chicken and hormone-fed beef, and I can assure anyone worried about such food entering our markets that our standards are not up for grabs. But we cannot have blanket bans on any food produced differently from the UK, which have a devastating effect on economies which we want to see benefit from free trade. I'm proud that we've struck trade agreements with the Côte d'Ivoire and the Southern African Customs Union, and we'll be launching our trade policy next year to help developing economies. And think how other nations would react to a ban. They would likely raise barriers in response. And I know the last thing people of Britain want to see is our goods banned from other countries' shelves. Indeed, I know the huge sense of pride that people feel when they see British goods and services being enjoyed around the world, whether it's British culture and music, driving a British-made car, playing on a British-designed computer game, or enjoying a British afternoon tea served on Stoke-on-Trent pottery. Our values-driven trade policy is grounded in the world we live in. We will not do deals at any price, but we know the price of not doing any deals. We need to move forward and embrace a trade-powered recovery. That's why I say to the British people, join with me in making the most of global Britain's return. Let's work together to strike down senseless barriers to trade and open up opportunity, spreading our world-leading standards far and wide. Let's make sure the global trading system works for the UK, for developing countries, and for our like-minded allies. Let's go forward together, learning from the mistakes of the past as we make a success of our value-generating and values-driven trade policy. With our like-minded allies, we can join the fight for free markets, free societies, and free trade. As I reminded our Board of Trade, we already have a great story to tell as a free trading nation. Now global Britain is back, it's time for the makers, the doers, and the innovators to help us write our most exciting chapter yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thanks for those remarks and laying out, I think, very clearly the government's approach to trade going forward, and I suppose an agenda that, as you've noted here, looks many years ahead as well in terms of the ambition that it has well beyond this intense moment of exit still from the single market. Obviously, your agenda is looking well beyond that. We've got a couple of questions. We've got time for a few questions. We may just drift a couple of minutes past the hour to give you a chance to turn to them. I know you want to take a few. And I suppose what I'm going to do is, rather than ask my own question first, I'm actually going to turn to one of the ones that we have from our guests here, partly because I think it is probably relates to the question that's on a lot of other people's mind, which is the kind of balance of returns. You've described a British trade agenda that is trying to be more nimble, or will be able to be more nimble, to hitch into the emerging markets around the world, and also the new forms of trade, as you said, around technology and services. The first question that we've got, however, from Chris Horstman is the following. It's been said that there's a Europe-shaped hole at the heart of UK trade strategy. Should DIT have been more involved in the EU-UK negotiations? So I suppose, is there a danger that by having these two things separated, all the work you're doing at DIT, is not aligned with necessarily, and is going to have to run a little bit against what's going on in the government? Should there be more of a DIT involved, or greater DIT involvement in the bilateral negotiation with the EU? Over to you.
We are very closely involved with the work that David Frost is doing on the EU deal. And it's in nature a different type of negotiation, because it also involves the regain of our sovereignty, which is very important. And I've been clear in the negotiations we're doing with the rest of the world, British democracy and sovereignty and the rights of our people to have a say are really important principles. So the same principles that we're negotiating with the rest of the world underlie our principles with the EU. And of course, we want to have good trade relations with the EU, provided they're on a basis of the UK being a sovereign and independent nation. And sometimes people try to sort of create these worlds as alternatives. They say that CPTPP is an alternative to having a trade deal with the EU. No, it's not. We want a good trade deal with the EU in the style of the CETA-Canada deal, and we want a good trade deal with CPTPP, and we want a good trade deal with the US. And this is how the UK can position ourselves as a trade hub, particularly in areas like data and digital and services, where I would suggest our policy is more forward-leaning than the EU.
Just let me, on that last point, bring my own question in here, because I think you emphasised a lot in your remarks the great strengths the UK has in that broad area of services, from data services through to financial, creative, etc. We know that within the EU itself, services trade has been a difficult thing to open up. But are you finding it any easier to open up markets to British services in other parts of the world? Services often are some of the most protected areas of national markets, sometimes for sort of national security type reasons in telecommunications, sometimes because of some very vested interests in law or finance. Are you confident that the UK will be able to use this moment of reopening all of these negotiations around the world to really open up services markets? What's your experience so far?
Well, as you point out, we're the second largest services exporter in the world, so it's absolutely in the UK's interest to be pushing services trade. And I think the Japan deal speaks for itself. We have achieved an advanced digital and data chapter that in some cases goes beyond the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've achieved improvements in mobility, improvements in protection for the creative industries, improvement in financial services. And the wider TPP arrangement does have some very advanced services chapters, which will be a baseline for all the negotiations we're conducting with the TPP countries. But I think we can go still further. So, for example, Singapore, New Zealand are both extremely advanced in digital trade. We can work with those types of like-minded allies, Australia as well. And the USMCA does go quite far in areas like digital and data. And again, that's of great interest to the UK in terms of our negotiation with the US, who are, of course, the other great services exporter. So I think this arrangement shows how much difference we can make in negotiating those services, digital and data deals. Now, of course, Robin, there are some tough negotiations. And of course, every country has its own interests that it wants to protect, but we are pushing those very hard in those negotiations because it's something we see the UK having a lot to gain in.
Thank you. I think maybe we can get two more questions in. I want one from me and one from a participant here. Ashton Hurton-Crabb from the LSE asked the following question. Given the risks of free trade to the world's most marginalized, women, the environment, should British trade deals be subject ex ante and ex post to ex ante and ex post sustainability and equality impact assessments? If not, why not?
Well, I believe that free trade is a force for good in the world and has lifted people out of poverty, and over time, is improving the environment. So, for example, in our new UK global tariff, we've reduced or eliminated tariffs on 100 green goods, and I think that we can use trade as a positive in areas like the environment, and of course, making sure that more people across the world have opportunity. But in direct answer to the question, we will produce an impact assessment that does cover those issues. We've just released one for Japan, and we will certainly be doing that for all of our trade deals.
Thank you. Let me ask you a quick question of my own here. China obviously is one of the markets in the world where 4 years ago, the British government was certainly putting a lot of emphasis. When he was Prime Minister, David Cameron tried to encourage the EU into doing a free trade deal with China. What is your thinking on how Britain can develop its trading relationship with what is currently the second largest market in the world, still not one that the UK, although growing, has as much export to? Would you emphasize more investment than a trade agreement? Do you have a sequencing thing in mind? Is it impossible politically right now? I'll let you answer the question as you want, but those are all things that I think come to many people's minds.
I think we need to be clear-eyed with China. Of course, there's an important trading relationship, and we have a lot of support for exporters exporting to China. Also, areas like investment are important. But as I mentioned in my speech, there have been issues specifically about the way disciplines the World Trade Organization has not been followed by all of its members in areas like transparency. So I would like to see improvements on that front. I think organizations like the Trans-Pacific Partnership are very helpful in creating a strong rules-based grouping that can challenge the fact that the WTO has not addressed some of these issues. So of course, we should continue to trade with China. Of course, we should seek to expand that trade, but we also need to be making sure that all players in world trade are transparent, are open, and are not using state-owned enterprises to push industrial subsidies.
And I presume that'll be something that you will make sure Britain's voice is strong on in the WTO and the kind of proposals for reform there. Which brings me to a question that I suppose is a little bit WTO connected, but very specific from Kate Holton at Reuters. What approach will the UK take to the Airbus-Boeing tariff row from next year? The UK is going to find itself in an interesting position, I suppose, on some of these protectionist battles that are taking place between the EU and the US. What's your thinking on the Airbus-Boeing tariff British position going forward?
We're extremely frustrated by the fact that this situation, which has been running for 15 years, hasn't been resolved. And industries such as the Scotch whisky industry have been unfairly affected by retaliatory tariffs. I am seeking as urgent resolution as possible. I'm in discussions both with the US and the EU to get those tariffs removed. But I think it's in everybody's interests to make sure that we have a proper aerospace industry, but also we don't have these retaliatory tariffs which simply damage businesses on both sides of the Atlantic.
But would the UK would carry on with the EU position, I presume, on imposing tariffs on US products for the moment, and not sort of get itself into a separate position from the EU, given the Airbus connection. This is one of the examples of a place where the UK is so tightly interconnected with production plants and so on across the EU and Britain. Is that going to limit your capacity for taking an independent position on these tariffs?
We are working as hard as we can to get those tariffs removed. And of course, the aerospace industry is important, and we work closely with the aerospace industry. We are focusing on getting those tariffs removed. And of course, we will keep all options open to make sure the UK is able to respond in kind if those tariffs aren't removed.
A last question. Sorry, I was muting myself there, trying to keep an eye. We have a lot of questions coming in. We don't have time for them. We've gone over 6 or 7 minutes already. So I'll give you a chance on the last question. And Secretary of State, if there's anything you want to add in closing. But we've got several questions, as you might imagine, coming in still on the Europe issue, which I know is not your core focus, but obviously will be as of next year. Europe is still the market with the most turnover within global trade, asks James Black. How are we going to manage the transition post 1st of January? Your aspirations are that we don't end up in a more protectionist environment bilaterally with our main EU partner. Anna Isaac asks a similar question. What's going to happen when we've had to reimpose potentially some of our own tariffs and have some in return? I presume the EU will become one of your main focuses after January the 1st. How are you going to deal with the hangovers of the deal?
Well, we want a good deal with the EU. We want a Canada-style deal, so one where there is zero tariff, zero quotas with the EU. And I'm already talking regularly to the EU Trade Commissioner, Valdis Dombrovskis, about how we work together at organisations like the World Trade Organization, where we share a lot of common interests with the EU. We want a system that works. We want one that's modernised for the modern age. And the EU is, of course, an important partner, as is the US, as is Japan, as are the CPTPP nations. So as far as I'm concerned, that working relationship is there, and we are ready to work together on common interests.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary of State. I know, as I said, we've gone over probably a little bit more than even I said, and I really appreciate you taking this many questions. I don't want to keep the agenda up anymore for the great set of panels we still have coming up. So, Secretary of State, we can't obviously do the normal thing and of a round of applause, for joining us, but also for sharing this comprehensive approach that the UK is taking to its future trade policy. I'm sure people will have lots more questions they'll be following up with you on later on. We are going to turn shortly to Sumaya Keynes, who will tackle the issue of our first panel on new patterns in global trade. Sumaya, it'll be over to you in a minute, but thank you again, Secretary of State.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.